An ordinance to establish a citizen review board for certain matters in the Little Rock Police Department to declare an emergency. Second reading.
Is there a motion? There's a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Now we have gotten to the we've had 2 readings now. What we will do is allow time for individuals who have signed up to speak and move from that forward. We'll now have Sergeant Rodney Lewis.
I think you only read it twice.
Mayor, you haven't voted on the motion.
Right, we're letting the agenda cards.
Okay.
Yeah, we're letting the agenda items speak first before we vote on them. Yeah.
We haven't read it.
Third reading.
Yeah, they did vote.
Yeah.
An ordinance to establish a citizens review board for certain matters in the Little Rock Police Department to declare an emergency. Third and final reading.
Now we've had 3 readings before we go for a vote. We'll now spend this time to allow those who come to speak for and against item number 14. We have Sergeant Rodney Lewis. And again, Sergeant Rodney Lewis, thank you so much for your service to our city and our state.
Thank you, Mayor, and to the Board of Directors. A point of order here. We've talked with the FOP president, and I think we've got there's a representative for the FOP that's going to come forward and speak to you about the things that we've already collaborated on. And I'd like to
Yield that
take
time.
a step back and let him come forward and say his, and then I'll come back and approach.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chad Cummings.
It's not usually loud.
Ladies and gentlemen of the board, and Mayor Scott, thank you for letting me come and speak to you. My name is Chad Cumming, and I have been asked to represent the FOP and the Black Police Officers Association. And specifically, we have concluded that the Citizens Review Board is not an appropriate ordinance to pass, and we urge you to vote it down. The primary reason is because there is not a need for it. Right now, the citizen review already occurs. There is an existing form of review, and we think the primary issue is that there's a lack of public education and knowledge about how much civilian review is present. For example, there are 5 existing agencies and investigative bodies that review police action. This would add a 6th. Most of those have existing forms of appeal. They have due process. They have jurisdictional processes. They have areas of concern. These are complicated issues, so complicated that you're receiving 34-page memos in this afternoon, even though because they've taken weeks to research. This would add a 6th body, and as you've been told, it's been intended to be a Type 4 civilian review board under DOJ guidelines. Now, what that was described as is something that reviews the processes and procedures for fairness and thoroughness and adherence. That's what has been described to you. However, when you read the details of this ordinance, that is not what the writing in the ordinance does. This instead reviews an investigation for accuracy, completeness, impartiality, and objectivity, and thoroughness. Under Section 8 of this ordinance, the CRB would be able to reach 3 conclusions. 1, that the investigation is incomplete. 2, that it concurs with the completed investigation, or that the investigation's findings are not supported by the facts. So this is not a review of the processes and procedures. This is an investigative body. This is a determination of facts. Well, that's not what a Type 4 civilian review board does. And when it's making a finding of facts, it's doing so in an incomplete process because, as that memo explains, there are limits in what a civilian review board can do. And so this review board is going through a review of limited access to details and facts, but it's reaching a conclusion about whether or not that determination of facts in the investigation was thorough. That is different. And as it does that, it has no legal standard of review of whether or not that investigation it is reviewing was thorough and complete. When you appeal a decision to a higher court, there is a standard of review that court takes to determine whether or not the lower fact-finding court had reached an appropriate conclusion. This is not present there. There's no guideline there. There's no member of law enforcement that is involved. There are suggestions that there will be training for the CRB members, but there's not even a non-voting member of the law enforcement in this civilian review board. Imagine, if you will, a review board that looks at the actions of the fire department and whether or not they used appropriate steps to address an emergency without an actual member of the fire department giving them expertise and knowledge. Now, this review board does have the ability to bring in forensic witnesses, but that's not the same as a thorough training. We're talking about something that's incredibly complicated. So, you were told this was going to be a review board that looks at the processes, that looks at the procedures, and is an audit of those procedures, but instead you have a fact-finding body. That is a distinction that is very important, and it is something that is either you have either been told one thing and you've been given something else, or it's not been properly written. In either case, we urge you that you should not vote for this ordinance. Now, there's also an issue that we have raised about due process rights. If the CRB is reviewing complaint procedures and policies, there are still due process concerns, but here we're talking about an investigative body, a fact-finding procedure. Now, in that situation, the CRB presents a report to the mayor, to the chief of police, and the city manager. That could lead to additional disciplinary action. Anytime an investigative fact-finding body goes to the chief of police, that can lead to further disciplinary action. One example of how this can interfere with the due process procedures, when you are looking at an investigation, at a fact-finding procedure, the subject of an investigation has due process rights, notice and an opportunity to be heard, the right to have representation. These are not there. If you look at the most recent details in that memo, it notes that that this body does not have subpoena power, but it does very specifically state it can note when the police officer refuses to answer CRB questions. That has an implication that has danger for that officer. If you look at the details of this investigation, the CRB has the ability to look at all of the file. Now, right now, there are very specific legal and jurisdictional limits on what internal affairs can ask and what a criminal investigation can ask, and whether or not those two things can cross. That's because of protecting a police officer's due process rights. Now, this ordinance says the CRB can look at internal affairs statements. Then it can report those to the chief of police and the mayor and the city manager. Again, that's a due process concern. Another due process concern is the CRB, Civilian Review Board. It initiates an investigation upon a determination that a police officer should be punished. That officer does not have a delay in whether or not the officer can file an appeal to the Civil Service Commission. That officer still has to file within that Civil Service Commission time period. Now, the CRB ordinance, it specifically says that the Civil Service Commission's appeal is held until the CRB's investigation can be determined. Now, first of all, you have the question: can a Civilian Review Board ordinance change the time frames that are required of the Civil Service Commission? That's a legal question. But even if it is, you've got a scenario where an officer has a determination. There's a disciplinary action waiting. Now this officer has to wait on his Civil Service Commission appeal while the CRB conducts its investigation. that delay in the officer's appeal rights has yet another due process implication. Those are also very significant problems. Now, we see that this latest amendment is addressing some of the structural problems. For example, one of our first concerns was that the directors were not given the power to approve CRB members. That's apparently in the latest revision that is available. However, what our biggest concern is that the board still has limited oversight powers in these actions. And so why not give the board more involvement? Why not only give the board the ability to approve of them? Why shouldn't the board perhaps be naming a member? The big thing about that we're concerned about, beyond the issues I've already raised, is that there's so much of this that is not finished, and the devil is in the lack of details. The problem is that there's so many things that are not spelled out. There are no bylaws. There's no time. There are very limited time limitations. There's no legal written guideline that we've seen so far that determines whether an initial complaint or a request review, which ones get reviewed, which ones don't. That's not been determined yet. There are still concerns about the protection of confidential information. The example of the internal affairs issue that we just raised. That's just one of them. There's limited funding, yet we're supposed to be able to bring in expert witnesses. All of these things are very important details that still need to be worked out. The police officers are not against civilian oversight. They note that they've had civilian oversight already. However, what they think everybody should do is pause. Make sure this is done properly. Maybe make sure that it's written in the way that it is taking the political elements out of a civilian review. Maybe make sure that the initial intent of a civilian review board that looks at policies and procedures, not specific investigations, maybe that would actually be reflected in the details of the ordinance. And for these and for many other reasons, we urge the board to please vote this ordinance down.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you.
Director Richardson? Oh, and maybe, yeah, yes, sir.
Mr. Cummings, can I get you back up front? Mayor, let's be real brief, 'cause I suspect we're going to spend a lot of time on this tonight, probably more time than we spent on about 3 triple homicides in the last 3 years. Did I hear you correctly to say you're speaking on behalf of FOP and BPOA?
They asked, yes, sir.
You did say you're speaking on behalf of FOP and BPOA.
The BPOA asked me to speak on behalf of
I
the
just wanted to make
businesses.
sure I heard that. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Director Hendrickson?
I wanted to ask you, how many cards do you have that's speaking on that issue?
Actually, we are now moving to the 4 comments. So we had 2 against, and the 2 against were combined. That was Sergeant Lewis and Mr. Chad Cummings were combined because Mr. Cummings represented the FOP.
No, none other.
Now we have 4 more, and should be.
I was just asking about a limit because this gentleman really took
Yes.
a lot of time.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Some of it was redundant to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Miss Eve Jorgensen?
If I may approach, sir.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to follow up on him. And I'm not going to belabor the point here. I think that we all know why we're here, at least on the police side, in reference to this CRB. My name is Rodney Lewis. I am the president of Black Police Officers Association. And we did collaborate with the FOP in reference to coming here tonight. And I think most of the things that he said that we are in line with. Now we do, from the BPOA side, if a need for a citizen review, we would support that if the language was right inside of the ordinance. But as of right now, from what we've read with the first ordinance, we don't agree with a number of things that's involved in the CRB ordinance.
Yes, sir.
Just to name a few, I know that most of the members will be picked by the mayor, and I feel like that we've been involved in a lot of conversation with you, Mayor, and the President of the FOP in reference to a number of things that's come up in the past, and we still like to be involved in those issues with you moving forward. As far as this ordinance, I said we don't agree with it just because of the language that's in there. Now, I would request, sir, that to get this right, to make this work for everybody, for the FOP and the BPOA and all the members of the police department, the chief's office, the whole entire department, we would like to come to the table and sit down with you. A member of the BPOA, a member of the FOP, the chief's office, the city attorney, because we want to get this right. There's a number of people that can be on this board, and without us knowing or not having any input in who those people are, we like to at least have a Q&A session with them, a vetting process, so that we know that we're getting the right people to sit in on this board. And again, I don't like it, and to me it appears like it's almost circumventing the police department, the chief of police himself, his decision-making role, which means that the CRB can go back and say, hey, y'all didn't do a thorough job in investigation. What I propose is that, Mr. Mayor and the board, that we get in behind our police department. We've got qualified detectives that can work these cases, and to have a single incident to go through, it's going through 5 different investigations, from internal affairs to a sergeant, lieutenant, captain, assistant chief, and then final decisions on the chief.
Yes, sir.
But there are things on here about physical injury, serious physical injury with the use of force, and that's one of the things that the CRB can take a look at. But we propose to you, sir, that most of the time when we get into some type of altercation that's with a citizen, yes, there's going to be some type of an injury, whether it be a scratch or a bruise. That's what we call a minor use of force. But under the terms of this ordinance, that would be reviewable by the board. And we feel that serious physical injury would be something that would take precedence over a physical injury, which could be just a cut on the finger. It could be just any minor injury. And so we're concerned about that. And
And Sergeant Lewis, initially you did share that you wanted to yield your time
Yes, sir.
to Mr. Cummings.
Yeah,
But I want, out of respect, I wanted to definitely want you to come back up and share. I think
Yes, sir.
some of the same concerns, and just
Yeah.
so you know, as we discussed the Citizens Review Board months ago, you and Officer Morgan, who's the FOP president, we will have an open line of communication. We'll continue to work together with one another. Because I think we all want to make certain that public safety is priority number one for our entire city. I want to make certain that you know, at least from the bottom of my heart, that how much I respect, admire the Little Rock Police Department, what you guys do each and every day to wake up and protect and serve everyone in the city of Little Rock. In times, there'll be times when we have to agree to disagree,
Yes,
and we'll continue to work together and keep that open line of communication. But we'll carry on and go with Ms. Eve. But did you have a few more comments?
No, I just, thank you for your time, and like I said, all we want is a seat at the table so we can
You have
really
one.
iron this thing out where it needs to be.
Yes, sir. Ms. Eve?
Good evening, Mayor Scott and City Board. My name is Eve Jorgensen. I am a gun violence prevention advocate and a longtime Little Rock resident. I'm here today to applaud this innovative proposal for a citizen review board for the City of Little Rock. What I think is so powerful is that this isn't a separate investigation. This is much needed quality control to ensure that the investigative process already in place is working as it is meant to. Some people believe that our law enforcement investigations already provide enough accountability, while others believe more transparency is needed. One extra layer of review can only help, while the perceived lack of accountability can be very divisive. My hope is that this review board will help the citizens of Little Rock trust the process more, and that the number of these cases of use of force will lower. By allowing this level of transparency and empowering the community, I am hopeful we may finally see a new level of trust between our community and the police. I urge you to vote yes.
Thank you, Ms. Eve. Amy Pritchard.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the board. My name is Amy Pritchard, and I'm a resident of Stiff Station. I'm a local attorney and a law professor. Through my legal work and volunteer work, I work with some of the city's most underserved and disenfranchised communities, including people experiencing homelessness, people returning from incarceration, domestic violence survivors, immigrants, and families experiencing extreme poverty. I hear a lot about people's perceptions of law enforcement and their beliefs about law enforcement. Many individuals, particularly in some of these communities, have a distrust in law enforcement that may bleed over into an unwillingness to cooperate fully in criminal investigations. While some of this distrust is rooted in historic interactions between law enforcement and communities, it also comes from a lack of involvement with law enforcement processes and a feeling of voicelessness and powerlessness as it relates to public safety. I can understand this feeling regarding law enforcement. As a child, I had frequent experiences with police when they were called to my home for domestic violence incidents. This was back in a time when law enforcement didn't know how to best respond to domestic violence, so many times encounters left my mother and myself feeling more vulnerable and disempowered. My first job out of high school was working with the City of Seattle's Domestic Violence Unit. Through that experience, I got to work with the City of Seattle's domestic violence law enforcement officers in the late 90s when Seattle had a truly community policing model. As I worked with law enforcement officers on mortality review and other quality improvement measures, and went out with officers on ride-alongs, I developed a better understanding of how officers make their decisions. This understanding and engagement helped me alleviate some of this distrust that I had as a child. The Citizens Review Board will do something similar for our community. As I understand it, the board will not be conducting their own investigations, but will be acting as a community check on investigations. Just as it's important that residents see officers as members of the community, community members must feel engaged and included in the city's public safety goals. It's easy for the community to critique law enforcement and for fear and rumors to spread when the community is not informed and is left voiceless in public safety arenas. The Citizen Review Board will provide a greater sense of government transparency and accountability. This will develop a greater sense of trust between citizens and city government and will help further public safety goals. For this, I ask the board to vote in support of this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pritchard. Senator Joyce Elliott.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members. Before I start my comments, I want to set a context for you of the district that I represent. And a part of that district is a 72204 zip code. And last time I looked, I represent that zip code where a group of people have more interaction with law enforcement than any other zip code. But I also, if you think about my district, if you were to start at Children's Hospital and just go straight across 630 until you get to Kirby Road by the big Walmart, and then just go straight back to the county line, you've got my district. And if you think about what that district is, you can understand why I might have a real interest in that. And so before I get to what I want to say from my own perspective, I want to respond to some things. We hear that there's not a need for this. I understand that there is a need because of what I see and hear every day. And what I would really like is for the police officers not to think this is some kind of attack on them. It is not. It is really time for the community and the police to come together and not see each other as the enemy. And this is one way of doing that. If we'll work together and not think of it as a zero-sum game, because this community depends on our doing more than we're doing now to work together. And this is one way. And there is something said about we don't know what the rules are. They're not in here. You normally don't have rules in the ordinance that you write. What you do is you put on paper what you want to do, and then you write the rules. There are no bylaws. I've looked this up, and generally what happens is once the board is constituted, then the board writes the bylaws. They're not supposed to be in the ordinance. And funding is an issue. Obviously, we know we don't have a lot of money just lying around. There's something right now from 150 to 200 boards across cities that have these boards. And I noticed that the cost for some of them range all the way from $20,000 to over $1 million, San Francisco being the highest. And if we think about this only as a political endeavor, we're going to miss the point of this being community building. We cannot see it that way. And lastly, what I heard was that the mayor is going to appoint all of the members. And in my research that I did, where I went to the United States Department of Justice to take a look to see what their guidelines are, and I looked at many of these cities, the mayor does appoint these people. It goes all kind of ways, but that's not anything unusual. And just to give you a quick summary of what's in that citizen review of police from the United States Department of Justice from the National Justice Institute, here are their findings. I can't give you the whole thing. They looked at what would be good from the individual's perspective, and this is what people said. The people felt validated that they were a part of the process, and they could have their voices heard, and they could have more believability in what goes on, or credibility from both sides. They were satisfied at being able to express their opinions and express them in person, whether they won or did not win. It was still a social capital building process. And they feel they were contributing to holding the department accountable, but at the same time, they were held accountable themselves, because you can't just come up and just say something and think it's going to be, somebody's going to say, well, you're right just because you said it. And then they looked at it from the police and the sheriff's perspective. One, improve their relationship and image with the community. And it has strengthened the quality of the department's internal investigations of alleged officer misconduct and reassured the public that the process is thorough and fair. That accrues to a positive thing for everybody. And lastly, has made valuable policy and procedure recommendations, because sometimes when you're so close, you don't see. And Mr. Mayor, I'm wrapping up, because the third perspective, the third perspective was to come from the local elected folks. We're talking about you now. What's the advantage for you guys? It enables you to demonstrate your concern to eliminate police conduct and engage the community. That's a good social capital building process. And it reduces, in some cases, not all, the number of civil lawsuits or successful lawsuits against the cities or the counties. And I want to end with saying nobody's pretending this is a perfect process, but nor are the processes that we have right now. If we think we have too many, before you forego this one, something that 150 to 200 cities around the country are already using, maybe something we have not right now is not working. We don't have to have 6 or 7. We don't have to throw this one out because we have others. We can decide which of those others maybe do we not need to have. I thank you so much for hearing me, and I urge you to please vote yes.
Thank you so much, Senator Elliott. Judge Ollie Neal, retired Judge Ollie Neal.
Mr. Mayor, city directors, I'm going to be very brief because Senator Elliott and Professor Pritchett have really covered the points I need, but I need to tell you just a couple of things about my perspective and what I arrived at during the course of developing that perspective, that is, the experiences I had. I retired as a judge on the Arkansas Court of Appeals. Prior to that time, I served as a circuit judge for the First Judicial Circuit. And prior to that time, significantly, I served as the prosecuting attorney for the First Judicial Circuit. Now, the prosecuting attorney is involved, as Mr. Carpenter can assure you, in much of the decision-making as to how the police prosecutions proceed. Got a little influence on that, a little determination. And so many of my sheriffs, I had 6 county sheriffs, and I believe there were 7 Class A city mayors with police chiefs. And at least one of my sheriffs just determined that he wasn't going to work with me because I represented the folk that were all the troublemakers. That is, these same folk that Joyce and Miss Pritchett would never mention, but these folk that look like this and sometimes want to act up. Now, that sheriff and I we never became warm friends, but our communication was not exactly the kind that would be appropriate for this city. We were in the country in Forest City, and that's a different place. But by the time I left the prosecutor's office, I assure you not one of those 6 sheriffs, nor one of those 7 police chiefs will tell you that that process was anything other than fair, and also that many of those citizens who hated the sheriff, who hated the chief of police, who hated the police said, well, if you work with them a little bit, they'll give you, it works out sometimes. So what I want to say to you simply is that I don't want to give you all the legal support for how you do this, but the fact of the matter is that if you adopt a position that allows there to be a greater transparency, a greater understanding as to what is going on between the time that something happens and final decisions are made, people are much more receptive when they understand it. Now, the prosecutor is not in a position to announce, here's what I thought about as I decided whether to charge this individual. I consider this, and he doesn't do that. He says, we find that the conduct is within bounds of law and we will not charge. That's not a quote, but that's basically what he says. And yet, my wife was a fairly intelligent woman, had a chance to serve as superintendent of schools on one occasion, would say, I don't know why he said that. And the fact of the matter is that what I know would be a speculation based on the fact that I have served as a prosecuting attorney. But why do we expect that all of our people then would understand why that decision could be made? That's what this Citizens Review Board will do. It will make certain that there's an understanding of how we arrive at this. Now, on the other hand, it's a little uncomfortable for somebody to be looking at you. An officer's uncomfortable. I mean, my sheriff in St. Francis County was quite uncomfortable having me telling him what he could prosecute and could not, because I didn't look like the folk he had dealt with. So, I urge you to bring Little Rock into at least the greater potential for that large segment of this population here joining in and believing in this police department is here to protect and serve and not as its enemy. I would support this ordinance.
Thank you, Judge. This is our last card to speak for, Judge Wendell Griffin. He's not here. That being said, before we go to the third reading, are there any questions from the, before we go to the vote? We've already had 3 readings. So before we go to a vote, are there any questions? Director Hendricks.
I've been sitting here for 12 years, 13, and if it's ever a time that I've seen race rise to its highest level, it's now. I want to ask that gentleman, he doesn't need to come to the mic. He talked as if, was he a lawyer?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, all lawyers don't know everything, okay? They can speak what they want to speak. But I'm really surprised that we even have a motion on the floor to defer this, as it has been said by the judge, and I think that he spoke eloquently about the issue and about us as board members.
And Director Hendricks, just so you know, the motion on the floor is right now we're ready to vote, so there's no delay. Once we go for a vote, it'll be decided. So, yes, ma'am.
I wish Who called that vote? I got something for him. Who did that?
We're ready to vote. We'll go to Director Webb. Director Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple of quick questions and then a comment. I wanted to ask both about the bylaws and the training, and I don't know if it would be Tom or you or somebody who might elaborate on what that might look like.
Yes. Before again, and I'll speak with the training and the appointments and things of that nature. Again, everything that this board has seen in regards to the ordinance that you saw 7 days ago remains the same. Anything that's been added to, as you all have copies right now, anything that has been added have been suggestions that's come from this body and that we accepted and made those clarifications as we move forward. As it relates to the board, with any board and commission within the City of Little Rock governing structure, the mayor makes appointments to those boards and commissions, and the city board ratifies. And so this board would ratify those appointments moving forward. If this ordinance is passed, when we make those appointments, we will make certain that those appointees will receive training on policies and procedures from the Little Rock Police Department. Chief Keith Humphrey will lead that effort in making certain that there's great training before they begin to start their body. And as with Civil Service Commission and anything else, there are bylaws that are adopted by the board in conjunction, and the city attorney works to make certain that any bylaws that are adopted, that they're legal within the confines of the City of Little Rock. So hopefully that answers your question.
It did, thank you. And if I could just make a comment.
And again, before that, which mean that anything would have to be legal, ethical, and constitutional. And this particular ordinance is legal, ethical, and constitutional. Now, that doesn't mean we all agree on it, but it's legal, it's ethical, and it's constitutional.
Thank you. I think Senator Elliott and I read some of the same articles and then a few that were also different. I mean, I read one article that said they didn't like the civilian review boards because they were too biased against the police, and then I read another one that said they didn't like them because they were filled with people from the unions. And frankly, I have faith in the mayor, and I have faith in the city board, and I have faith that with the appointments that you will vet appointees, and that we will vet those appointees. We've spent a lot of time talking about 21st century policing. I mean, we've talked about that whenever an issue, a residency issue or community-oriented police or things like that have come up in the last few years. And when we refer to documents that from the National League of Cities, which provides us with outstanding material on many different topics, in their handbook on 21st century policing, one of the things that Senator Elliott alluded to, in which it states very clearly in that document, is the role that we play as elected officials, as city officials, is fostering trust and promoting transparency. And this ordinance gives us an opportunity to do that, to build bridges, to build trust. I'm confident that the training will be good. I am confident that the appointments will be solid. I think the community engagement and the trust that we can build through this is important. I support the police. I support the community. And I don't think 150 to 200 other cities would have passed this and keep passing this if it were something that didn't work. So I'm going to vote for this ordinance tonight.
Thank you so much, Director Webb, and I definitely agree with you. And also, if this ordinance is passed, I want to make a strong commitment and to give my word that before anything goes into action, there will be education of everything, so everyone is aware as we move forward. So I do appreciate your support. Director Richardson?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. A couple of quick points. I don't think we're looking at this as a panacea. I don't think that we're saying this to be all and cure all. I think this is a segue for us to develop a more community engaged process. Here's what I find interesting, really, really interesting. The places where we need the heaviest police presence happen to be the places where we have the worst community police relationships. When we had an uptick in crime and homicides a couple of years ago, the reason why we could not solve them, according to our police department, was we had poor community relationships. We couldn't have any involvement with the community. They wouldn't talk to us. I think Dr. Pritchard, Senator Elliott, I think Judge Neal, they all alluded to that. And that's one of the ways we bridge the gap between community and police. Some places in our city of Little Rock, unfortunately, we protect and serve. Other places we patrol and control. And I'll give you one quick example. The day after 18-year-old Justin Bell was murdered on 11th and Lewis, the following morning I rode to that area. And I saw a couple of police officers engaging some residents, riding bikes. They stopped and they're engaging them. And one of them practically told one of the constituents that she could not be in Little Rock because she was on parole and she lived in North Little Rock. And when she questioned that, he immediately got into this confrontative kind of conversation, which I was thinking, well, and I asked one of the police officers when they got there, do y'all know what happened? No, we just found out this morning. They probably know more than we know. Well, that didn't lend itself to her willing to cooperate with them because of the way she was engaged and the way that they dealt with her. So I decided to give them a ride to where they were going, which was 16th and Peyton. And one officer said, don't take them to your house. What? I've done gang intervention prevention work in that area for a number of years. And what I found interesting was one of the officers told me, when I asked him that morning, do y'all know anything that's going on? Well, I just found out this morning. They probably know more than we do. The day that he had a confrontational conversation with, when she just questioned his comment about she didn't have the right to be in Little Rock because he was on parole from North Little Rock. That's what he essentially told her. I sat and listened, I heard that, and I agree that we need to figure out a way to improve community police relationships. And the places where we have the worst community police relationships are the places where we need the heaviest police presence, the heaviest police involvement. And I think Senator Elliott made reference to 72204 and some of the criminal activity in that area, some of the other areas we're talking about in our city. We need to take that in consideration. This is not the panacea. It's not a panacea, but it could be a segue for us improving the process that we have in place. And we need to think about that and don't think that this is an attack on the police. Since I've been on this board, there's been no department in the city of Little Rock that's had more support from this board than the police department. That's the cognitive dissonance when I hear people say, well, it's an attack on the police. It's happened to hurting the police morale. There's been no department, no entity since I've been on this board that's enjoyed more support, unquestioned support for the police department than this city board of directors. Man, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Director Richardson. Director Adcock.
Yes. As we sat down in here this afternoon, we received the answers to our questions that we were asked last week, last Tuesday here, and we have just now received the answers. Some of you have called me and asked me questions. I couldn't give you the answers because I hadn't received them. I will not be supporting this because I do not think that this board has had an opportunity to look at this. Our questions have not been answered until we walked in here. This is 34 pages, and I'm sorry, I've listened to you speak. I have not sat here and wrote or listened to or read 34 pages. So I will not be supporting this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Adcock. Director Hendricks.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to comment on Senator Elliott and the other young ladies that's on the front row with her. I do appreciate you being here and speaking out. The reference that Director Adcock mentioned a moment ago, it's a reply from the city attorney that it's nothing wrong. Maybe I shouldn't use the word wrong, but we had a right to do what we're doing in presenting this bill. It's nothing legal that would keep us, that would make this illegal, what we are doing. And I think that everybody up here ought to give this a chance. And I still say, God bless this board if they turn this down. And I will pray for them tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Hendricks. Director Compuris.
Thank you, Mayor. I think in principle what you're talking about is great. And I think that if we took the time to really look at it and properly think about it and have the input of all the citizens, we could come to something we're all happy with. I don't think in my time on this board that I've had the entire police department that have said, slow down, that have said, let us have time to participate, that we want to have something that help us police, but we don't feel like we're included. And I think that speaks volumes to what we're doing. I would be very supportive of trying to work through this process and find something that everybody can support. And I'm very much like Joan. I'm going to have to vote against this tonight, mainly because I think that it's not exactly where we need to be. There's an old saying about measure twice and cut once. And I don't think we are doing that with this ordinance. And as I said, I will be very supportive of trying to work through it. I will be very supportive to do whatever I can to make it where everybody's included. But doing it this way, this quickly, without all the facts, I can't do it.
Well, thank you so much, Director Campuris. Director Peck.
Thank you, Mayor. This has been a really difficult decision, and that I've given lots and lots of thought to. I want to thank the people that came here to talk on both sides, and the number of people that have reached out to me about this. I think there's a lot of confusion about exactly what will the Citizens Review Board look like. And I don't think it's necessarily so much a resistance to the notion, to the idea, but just a lack of education, a lack of understanding. And I want to especially give a thanks to my colleague and friend Kathy Webb, because she summarized a lot of my feelings quite eloquently. And I'm just going to have to trust, and I'm going to surprise a lot of y'all, because I said I'm going to vote no, yes, but I will be supporting it.
Thank you so much. Yes, ma'am. We're going to, Director Hinch, we'll get to the judge. Director Fortson.
A lot of my thoughts have already been expressed by others, but I do have a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Mayor. There have been 2 or 3 references made to changes in the ordinance. We had an ordinance distributed last Tuesday, which was placed on the agenda for tonight. And I guess my inquiry is, are we voting on the language that was distributed last Tuesday, or have the changes that have been alluded to in some of the conversation been brought out there? And if so, has the ordinance been amended to reflect them?
Yes, it's all online, all the changes that's been passed out to you. We've already conferred with our city attorney. That's all perfectly legal. What you have before you is actually online right now as well. And I just a bit of caution. Yes, that's just the answer. Your question is yes. We're within parliamentary procedure. Director Richardson, did you have another? Or did I? Yes. Director Richardson.
Mayor, if none of my other colleagues want to speak on this, I move to approve.
There's a motion and second to approve. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Ayes have it. Roll call.
Director Hendricks.
Voting to pass it, to approve it. You want to hear the judge before the vote? We can't do that, Director. We gotta vote, Director Hendricks. But
Director Hendricks.
you can vote yes for it. She says yes.
Director Richardson.
Yes.
Director Webb.
Yes.
Director Peck.
Yes.
Director Hines.
No.
Director Wright.
Yes.
Director Campuris.
No.
Director Fortson.
No.
Director Adcock.
No.
Vice Mayor Wyrick. It's 5-5.
Yes from the mayor. Thank you, everyone.